Hello everyone, today we talk about the Hephthalite-Sasanian Wars, spanning the mid-5th to mid-6th century, constituting a pivotal episode in military history of the late antique Sasanian Empire, 224-651, the last pre-Islamic Iranian empire ruled by the House of Sasan, centered on the Iranian plateau and Mesopotamia, characterized from the Sasanian side by devastating defeats, strategic recalibrations, and eventual triumph. We talked about Sasanian warfare in the very early days of Schwerpunkt, and by some caprice of our lottery extraction, we never really dealt with this topic in any sort of relevant fashion anymore. We made actually just too straightforwardly military and quite even relatively watched videos about Sasanian warfare, including the one about Sasanian cataphracts, heavy cavalry, the Persian army organization between the 3rd and 7th century. So there is actually more than that. We talked about them, of course, in the Byzantine series as well, but the bulk, the core, the quantity is really not there. We addressed them, of course, in the video about the death of Julianus. We will surely make more videos about them. Months ago, I made a video about the rise and fall of the Iranian civilization through an Indo-European lens, so to say. We have, however, a pretty hefty medieval Persian warfare playlist, which in a sense is very much like the continuity of this, as also we have made videos about the Parthians on a regular basis, even though it's not so many, telling the truth, but still to provide some context, continuum, and so on. The reason why today's topic is so relevant in a way is twofold. From one side, it was just like a very big clash that deserves to be recounted in the annals of military history. From the other, it's really a world on its own, like an era that you can sort of vibe with if you think about the parallels with the Justinian end, but it's just like a big universal history on its own. The Sasanians had this in their own frontiers, were sort of importantly different from the Byzantine ones at this point, but also aside from the fact that they had that in common as well with each other in the Levant, and as you know, it was a pretty mobile frontier at some point. They especially coped with these peoples of the steppes, right? And you know that by this point we really made, even inadvertently, I would say, really lots of videos about Central Asian warfare, right? We've seen both Eastern, Western Asian warfare all across, like also the peoples that straddle today. We'll talk about the Gök Turks, for example. They made a video on the warfare of the summer. So it's actually the intersection of very different branches of our lottery that we evidently must continue, aside from the fact that this video, for example, is also a special, right? But it makes sense only when you understand it. It's framed within this broader roadmap that I created on Schwerpunkt as a sort of time and in place travel machine, so to say. The immensity of the clash between sedentary civilization and the nomadic one, the parallelisms between the white and the black Huns, respectively infesting, in fact, here see the Sasanian and the Byzantine frontier, and the uniqueness also of those lands, the quite sort of much more feudal, private, shaded in sense political control of the Persians on their northeastern frontier. These peoples from the other side that at some point we'll also have to treat a bit more unitarily. I have something from the lottery, by the way, about Xiongnu warfare that really deserves, and more. Really have a lot of work here to do. Medieval Asian warfare, besides all the rest that we have to discuss. Now, these wars we treat today primarily involve the Sasanian kings Peroz I, who reigned between 459 and 484, and Khosrau I, Anushirvan, reigning between 531 and 579, the most celebrated Sasanian king, contemporary of Justinian, famed for administrative reforms and military success alike. On the other side, the Hephthalite Empire, we can't call it sort of different ways, it's better to address them as a people, right? The so-called White Huns, or Huna, a Central Asian polity of uncertain ethnic origin, possibly East Iranian, Turkic, or more likely mixed, as it mostly happened at that time, especially in the areas that they dominated, namely Bactria, Tokharistan, from essentially the mid-5th century to 560 AD. Right. We also talked about Bactrian, Tokharian warfare. As a matter of fact, we just discussed it recently in the video of Tang-Abbasid warfare that is a bit sort of ahead in the centuries, the mid-8th, as a matter of fact, but it's still part of this continuum. Also, as far as not just of sort of, for example, Sasanian at that point, they did not exist anymore, but in the sense that the projection of Persian power, mostly based on Sasanian legacy from the Islamic side, other peoples coming from the east, that case, namely the Chinese, but also the Turks, that as we've seen constituted a great part of their force, but also the continuity within probably these lands that had a character on their own, as it mostly happened in pre-industrial times, and even in these areas that were more exposed to the turbulent movements of the steppes, had essentially the upper hand in some broader cultural and social sense over the sort of the armies of the conquerors themselves. And that's why it's interesting to look at these places, because they were the same ones where Alexander had arrived, founded cities, and more, where the Achaemenids had been. And so there is, as you know, also in Sasanian political legacy, a great deal of inspiration to the older Achaemenid Empire, most successful of the Persian endeavors at Similia. The Hephthalite-Sasanian wars reveal the complexities of Persian military engagements in Central Asia that they naturally had some grip on, and that, in this sense, bothered a lot both Byzantines and the Chinese, but that was no child play to control. In fact, being there, especially at this point during the migration, there are lots of different peoples that de facto escaped, of course, any direct control in those areas. We witness to the Sasanian diplomatic interactions with the Byzantine Empire and all this, so the connection with Constantinople, this other great interlocutor. They weren't just enemies. The Persians have historically this extraordinary capacity of taking over Levant, no matter what. But of course, there was an enormous mutual influence. If you look at between Constantinople and Ctesiphon, if you look at the heavy personification of the Byzantine courtly sort of etiquette ceremonial, but also, and in fact, this is a bit underappreciated, the influence, in fact, from the greater power that was, in fact, had been Rome, also in the previous centuries in a more unitary sense. Here we're talking, again, the age of Justinian. It was something slightly sort of different, in fact, from the age of, say, Trajan, that could literally march on Ctesiphon, which is something that the Byzantines will do themselves, but think about the Battle of Nineveh, but that did not correspond anymore to the whole ensemble of sort of the Roman Empire at its greatest extent, and not just the territorial one, right? From the other, you see an interlocutor as the Gökturks, the first Turkic Khaganate, founded around the later part of here, of, as we will see, of the period of 552 in Mongolia. And again, as I said before, I just made this summer a video about the Gökturks, mostly from a military standpoint, but that's fundamentally also all what they were in practice. And looking at all the territorial connections, also with the Chinese, because mostly we've seen it from sort of the filter of Chinese sources at that point. A Khaganate that, as you know, firstly, we've seen it rapidly expanded westward under Bumain and his brother Istami. You have, in all of this, a profound impact on Persian warfare. As you see in the West, during the migration era, for example, a greater emphasis on cavalry, we would say, but the Persians had always had that. Well, there was a further intensification. There are different ways of the steppes that bring sort of different political and social balances that are translated into a military fashion. There had been a heavy destructuring of the same Persian society. When we talk about late antiquity, we would think that every enemy of our Roman point of view is living this moment of great splendor because they were taken over. Not really, right? These are actually desperate moves of systems that really feel also the pressure more, right? If you look at this in perspective, really, the Roman Empire is what the entirety of Western Eurasia and the Mediterranean revolved around, including Persia, as a matter of fact. And so a great capacity of strategic projection, for example, does not equate to permanent conquest occupation. It's sure, however, that at this point we're also looking at Sasanian power at its relative peak, coping with this apparently paradoxical dynamic. Greater territorial expansion because many other rulers around are actually collapsing, and they do not have the regional cohesion that Persia, at least from the plateau, this sort of mix between, again, the statalized, civilized Mesopotamian bases, at least in that sense, administrative and organizational sense, but sort of the fuel provided by from the Iranian plateau, and also through these external peoples. So a cohesive landmass, that was the other great power, the second great power after Rome, or practically the only one by that scale in Western Eurasia. But at the same time, a greater weakening, actually, of the local control, the attempts at stemming sort of barbarians through, we will see now, massive infrastructure that cost really an enormity, right? In terms of walls, for example, to keep enemies out. The military shrinks as well. In this sense, the later Sasanian Empire experiences something similar to what the Caliphate in a few generations will, in terms of practically the immediate presence of the immediate injection of Turkic, essentially Gulam, Mamluk fuel in their own army, right? Something that you can date from the time of which the Turks really arrived in greater numbers, even led by the Huns, for example, like the ones, I mean, talking about the black ones up to Europe and so on. And we usually don't make this continue because we somehow assume that, again, the rise of Islam changes everything. It's when the chapter about Rome and this late antiquity ends, and then you have the Islam later. It's sort of two separated things. In many ways, there is a massive continuity. Also of dynamics that had happened before, and actually not in a more stable and stabilized way than it had been in classical antiquity, also for example, the Caliphate. Now, today we will essentially look at the period of the rise of Peroz I, so his campaigns against the Hephthalites and the Kidarites that were the latter, I mean, an earlier Hannic dynasty that ruled Bactria and eastern Iran, roughly between 360 to 467, sometimes considered predecessors or relatives of the Hephthalites. Again, this video is not aiming at reconstructing like the genetic origin, let's say the migratory pattern, the ethnic identity. We're not going to look at that. Also because, again, also and especially here, there was a massive continuum, not just, again, from the waves of these Turkic rulers, but as we'll see now, in fact, as it's notorious, also a great deal of still Indo-European continuity among at least a substantial part of the subjects, including the sedentarized one, I mean, Bactria, Tokaria, that's what they had been. The eastern branch of Indo-Europeans. And even actually with Tocharians, an element of the West, as you know, because the Tocharians are much more similar, say, to the Celts, to the Italic and so on, than it is, say, to the Indians, or to even to the Persians themselves. In any case, you'll also observe the critical role of defensive infrastructure, like the Great Wall of Gorgan, this sort of Hadrian Wall of the Iranians that actually was longer than Hadrian's Wall, that is something like 110, 120 kilometers. This Great Wall of Gorgan was a massive 195 kilometers long brick barrier in northeastern Iran, second in length only to the Great Wall of China among ancient defensive walls. Per se, it doesn't mean much. They were sort of, at this, China is peculiar in its organizational capacity, sort of centralization of resources management, in terms also of metals production for arms, building all stuff. That's different. It doesn't mean that they were sort of dramatically distant from Rome. Like Han and Rome were actually pretty similar. You can't quite just look at, so first of all, different set of sources and how they're written to evaluate, you know, which was competitive, more competitive, or quote unquote superior. In any case, we appreciate, of course, the Persian capacity to establish this massive infrastructure in an area that, in fact, was very much at the frontier between the nomads and the sedentaries. We've seen this also in the videos about the Achaemenid army, including one of the Saka auxiliaries, and how tormented the relation in this probably northeastern frontier had always been for both sides, because it's a place where probably the divide between the two major sort of ecological zones, so to say, of the steppe, of the farming areas, it's much less sort of pronounced than it is in, for example, for Europe, right? It's sort of much more encapsulated into more neatly identifiable center dimension, and also for different international reasons does not have much going on in between, right? For the Iranians, it's something extremely different. And here I'm talking also Iranians, not just in a Persian sense, as I said before with the Sakas, for example, referencing to them. Also, we will look at some social-cultural aspects of this. For example, the religious relevance of sites such as the Bandian Fire Temple, that, as we've seen also in the videos about, the Iranian religion, the European legacy, was a late 5th, early 6th century AD of Zoroastrian complex in Dargaz, Khorasan, famous for its exceptionally preserved stucco decorations. We will also just express a military evaluation of this, because we witnessed to essentially the ultimate Sasanian and Turkic, because the Persians find allies out there, victory that dismantled the Hephthalite Empire. And of course, again, these were Turco-Iranians of some sort themselves, so they were also very similar to one another. Now, the ascension of Peroz I to the Sasanian throne in 459 was a turbulent affair marked by internal clashes and external pressures, as always. Persia was actually a mess. It was not a tidy, orderly, peaceful, sort of crystallized, more sort of, again, the Byzantine Empire in comparison was, you know, much more Europeanly crystallized in a way, like very granitically founded, stemming, as we've seen also recently, from a deep sort of version of Hellenic version of the Indo-European continuum in the Balkans. And following the death of his father, Yazdegerd II, who had ruled between 438 and 457. Think about what was happening, for example, in the West in the same years. In 457, a civil war erupted between Peroz and his brother Ormizd III, who reigned between 457 and 459. According to Iranian sources, Yazdegerd II had deemed only Peroz and Ormizd capable of ruling, leaving the succession to the discretion of the state's magnates and marzbans, that is, as you know, high-ranking noble governors of frontier provinces. These were key because, as we've seen, this is a very common dynamic in the Middle East. We've seen it also for the rise of the Abbasids and over the Umayyads. These provincial rulers have a great political weight, but especially in their military capacity to aggregate these war bands from the steppes that are, in this sense, swarming pretty much across everywhere, because there isn't, as we will see now also with the wall, what's going on, that does not work per se. You need moral force to keep to keep that up. And they can really provide critical manpower for these power struggles, right? And this decision, by the way, just to leave to the nobility to decide who would rise, was a way to say, okay, well, it's not great her bloodsheds as long as I'm alive, and obviously wasn't the best settlement. And it shows, by the way, how, like, perfectly well how oligarchically decentralized what we call Persia and the Sasanian Empire at large really was. This is within mostly the Iranian, but more specifically Persian nobility. Now, Aurangzeb initially secured the throne with the support of probably this is the majority of the establishment, but Peroz, leveraging military assistance from the Hephthalites, overthrew him in 459. Right, and this alliance starts everything. It's like a pact with the devil. It came at a steep price. In fact, territorial concessions, likely including parts of Tukharistan, the ancient name for the upper Oxus-Amudarya Valley region corresponding to northern Afghanistan and southern Tajikistan, Uzbekistan. And again, the Tokharians, they existed also beyond. If you look at the Tarim Basin, that was mostly like where the Kuchans were. Again, it's a bit complicated, but I made videos both about the Tokharians. I mean, in this sense, also Kucha was the most important of the cities in Kushan that is actually related etymologically speaking. So we're talking the Indo-Scythians connected with Bactria. So those areas show things that, like in Blade Runner, like you mortals have no idea of what, including like, the birth of some of the most powerful polities that, again, albeit sort of ephemeral, compared to the sanitary ones, would create, as in this case, lots of problems to them. This deal, first of all, shows how the Persian establishment could be properly, destabilized. At least the balance within the same could be, the typical balance could be an external force. All right, this is not to say that Persia wasn't actually the strongest base, but still, these Hephthalites have something to say in that. And the pact with Peroz strengthened Hephthalite control over Bactria, the historic region centered on Balkan northern Afghanistan, once the heart of the Greco-Bactrian and Kushan kingdoms, by the way. Peroz's early reign was further strained by a 7-year drought from 459 to 466. This is never great. It's interesting to see how, regardless of the fact that it's sort of self-evident that great civilizational crises happen mostly just for political and moral reasons, that there are major disasters going on, or at least that sort of impact environmentally an already strained situation. This happened a bit everywhere. Like the Persians control, for example, the famous dam of the Sabas in southwestern Arabia. Also at that point basically collapsed because they didn't have the technology anymore to keep reinforcing it. So we'll talk about that. And this situation inflicted severe economic hardships across Iran. Iranian sources such as Talibi, who died in 1038, so sort of half of a millennium later. This was a Persian historian and author of the famous Gurar al-Siyar, praised Peroz's management of the crisis, citing his efforts to distribute resources and maintain order in the process. However, Christian and Jewish chronicles paint a darker picture, condemning his persecution of religious minorities, particularly Christians, with the exception of the Nestorians, members of the Church of the East who accepted the teachings of Nestorians and were based primarily in the Sasanian Empire, often in opposition to the Miaphysite Christians supported by the Byzantines, right? And thus, in this sense, backed by the Persians against the Romans, because as we explained, it was definitely a Byzantine projectional capacity to create pretty devastating damage to Persia. So this picture is also quite fascinating because it is just like in Constantinople, the school of philosophy was being shut. The Jews were sort of ever more sort of burdened by limitations, the persecution, and so on. Equally, you see this shrinking, this sort of dark aura. So this is an oxymoron, but still, descending on these major and frightening empires, as a matter of fact. Probably it's the moral temper of the Justinian plague. It's all a pretty sort of dark situation. Here we're still in the sort of the end of the second half of the 5th century, so it's before that, but in general, the dynamics are very similar. I mean, also the 5th century, both in the western and eastern half of the empire weren't really that nice, so to say. We forget too much how the eastern half of the Roman Empire, while surviving, did not actually go under very different things to what had happened to the west. We're not talking about the Huns that are here also the object of our inquiry, right? So these persecutions sowed discontent, sparking revolts in regions like Albania, the ancient Caucasian region, roughly modern Azerbaijan and southern Dagestan, Iberia, that is instead the ancient eastern Georgia, basically, and Pers Armenia. This was a term for designing the Sasanian-controlled portion of historic Armenia, distinct from the Roman/Byzantine Western Armenia. If you're interested in this, I made some videos about medieval Caucasian and, say, Albanian, Georgian warfare. I also made a video about the war, the Neronian war against the Parthians in Armenia with Corbulo, etc. Again, we will talk more about that frontier. A very good sort of introductory video on the Byzantine Sasanian wars, for example, would be quite fascinating. And this would, needless to say, complicate Peroz's military campaigns in general, because as we were saying before, the actual capacity to directly control these populations is enfeebling over time. And so nominally, these peoples alone are not so threatening or vital themselves. Actually, they're having possibly the worst in all this. But also the bigger powers cannot control as far as they used to, right? And or they can, but it would cost really much. And so there is some establishment opposition to that as well. The important was, in any case, to consolidate the core. This is what Peroz was doing. Concurrently, he faced challenges from the Kidarites, a nomadic group possibly related to the Xionite Huns, who had emerged as a significant threat in the east. So you see, it's a bit like in Constantinople, there is always the next wave. Right? You can play with them diplomatically, you can use them as buffer states. This is also what happens here, but the waves also here are closer, geographically speaking, to Central Asia. And so they come a bit more, not necessarily more strongly, but they have sort of a more straightforwardly sequential vibe to them, and they hit also more or less the same places that get further destructured. Now, the Sasanian-Kidarite conflicts, which began around 350 under Shapur II, who reigned between 309 and 379. Yes, you have heard well, 70 years of reign. For real, right? And the longest reigning Sasanian king, in fact, also of many others, and a conqueror of Nishapur. So temporary alliances, such as because the Huns, as you know, were around in Western Eurasia from quite a while, really, not just like we are habituated to think them in the late 4th, at least the beginning of the 5th century in the West, but as we were just saying, here they had already arrived in some fashion, and they were mostly also incarnating, literally, because many of their subjects, and they also married into their dynasties and so on, were Indo-European, right? And you understand how they would play. They would be temporary alliances, such as when Kidarite cavalry supported Shapur's campaigns in the western Caspian region, notably at the siege of Amida, famously enough, against the Romans. This is the modern Diyarbakir in southeastern Turkey. We are in 359, where the Kidarite king Grumbatus lost his son in Persian service, by the way. And these auxiliaries were normally very dependent on the Senatries in general, because the whole deal of the nomads is, in any case, to revolve around the bigger power. And they often, just like the Goths, would, for Rome, after sort of couple of decades, pay an enormously high tribute of blood, probably in service of the peoples that they had somehow obliged to with them, but let's say also they also were completely dependent on, largely at least. Now, by Peroz's reign, relations had soured with these populations because everybody was becoming hungrier and angrier. From around 462, Peroz engaged the Kidarites, who had established themselves in Bactria, supplanting the Kushano-Sasanian kingdom that had been a 3rd, 4th century Sasanian vassal kingdom ruling the former Kushan territories in Bactria, northwestern India, even. That projection is quite interesting. Now, the Kidarite king, Kidara, proclaimed himself king of the Kushans on his coinage, asserting dominance over the region. Peroz's campaigns, likely supported by the Hephthalites, and so, again, the broader group of the Hephthalites, and there would be different tribes, different clans with different allegiances, to fight against this other sort of kin of theirs, culminated in a decisive victory by 468. Naturally, we don't know that much from the Persian sources and the ones in the area. At some point, we will make sort of more focalized videos on the various campaigns and so on, how we know about this. But we know fundamentally just that this victory enables the Sasanians to reassert control over Bactria, naturally in a decentralized fashion, but still essentially deciding who ruled there, with the same Peroz at the moment probably of the expedition and the conquest issuing coins at bulk. The ancient city of Bactria's traditional capital, major Silk Road hub, importantly enough, that's also what they were struggling for those places, modeled in turn, however, on Kidarite designs, so showing that Bactria had undergone an important sort of sociocultural change in the meanwhile, so that Peroz himself, in spite of his victory over the Kidarites, still issued coins in their fashion. And interestingly enough, this was still a Bactrian fashion on top of that. Very interesting, but also showing you how, in a sense, not necessarily civilized in an absolute sense, but how statally oriented still at this point of late antiquity, even some steppe powers could be once they install themselves an important sort of sanitary basin like Bactria was, and just the fact that they issued coins is sort of remarkable. In continuity with the form, evidently the local government administration, and it kept going on. Not without losses, again, we're talking the later 5th century, so also these places were very much deteriorated. They were big, they had lots of wealth, especially concentrated in these centers on the Silk Road. The hinterland was definitely wilder, right? But it was also largely sanitary. Now, this triumph, celebrated by a Sasanian embassy in Constantinople, I imagine, the arrival in the Bosphorus with this new showing off, we destroyed the Kidarites, look at us, allowed Peroz to shift focus westward. In fact, it wasn't really weren't good news for the Byzantines, as Peroz demanded financial support from the same Roman Emperor Leo I, reigning between 457 and 474, for maintaining the Derbent garrison. This was, as we said before, the strategic, this was notorious as the strategic Caspian Pass fortress in modern Dagestan, jointly guarded at times by Persians and Byzantines against northern nomads. We also recently seen in a video about the Ruthenian conquest of the Khazar Khaganate, how important Derbent really was and how it was coveted by all those competitors, and especially from the sanitary side, being a critical defense against northern nomads, right? And a bit like the measure of how much in control you were against them. Now, these requests were denied until at least the reign of Zeno, who reigned between 474 and 491. If you look at my Byzantine history playlist, we made an entire video about him. If I'm not wrong, I also made a video about Zeno's international policy. So, he's mostly important because at this point, Odoacer sends back the, insignia to Constantinople. So there is also the paving the way to the era of Justinian. But there is also this international connection with the Sasanian Empire. Things were going on in the Eastern Frontier. In fact, the Byzantine emperor, facing internal challenges at the time, opted to fund Persian efforts against the Hephthalites to avoid direct war, as always, tribute. The Hephthalite wars, as documented in Greco-Roman, Christian, Iranian, and Armenian sources, are traditionally divided into 3 campaigns under Peroz, occurring around 474-5, and 478-479, and 483-484. This campaign, as we've seen, reflected Peroz's ambition to reverse earlier concessions and assert Sasanian dominance in the east. But they also exposed his strategic miscalculations to an extent. The first campaign, around 474-5, was motivated by Peroz's intent to reclaim Tukharistan, ceded to the Hephthalites, as we've seen, as a payment for their support against Ormuzd III and possibly the Killerites as well. Because, yeah, those had already been a problem, as we've just seen. Now, Procopius of Caesarea, as you know, lived in essentially in the first half, in particular, of the 6th century, was the principal Byzantine historian of Justinian's era. We have read him naturally multiple times. We hadn't made so many videos about the Justinian and Reconquest. That's also another series you can really start. Just seen in a couple of battles. Well, he is, however, very insightful and sort of the best source of the time, as a matter of fact, also for this Eastern affairs, and describes Peroz assembling a substantial army, estimated several tens of thousands, which may be an exaggeration if we account, again, like the core of Sasanian army plus auxiliaries. We can easily arrive to, 35,000, 40,000 maximum. That would have been a massive stretch to begin with. It is true that in these areas, any war band is welcome. You don't even have to pay them, because they're going to loot and plunder just by gravitating around you, the core of your force. But again, there is a bit this giantism, especially as far as the East is concerned, like to show that the Sasanians were this strong Perus force. And also here to see like the initial shortcomings of the same. This expedition, interestingly enough, Procopius tells us, was accompanied by the Byzantine envoy Eusebius, who had been dispatched by Zeno to bolster Sasanian efforts on that occasion, for what partly also explained before. Now, the Hephthalites, led by King Kush-Nabats, also rendered Akshu-Navar Kush-Nabats, because this really depends on how you transliterate it, the most famous Hephthalite ruler of the period, were a formidable foe, distinct from other Hunnic groups. Right? This Hephthalites, unlike nomadic Huns, as we observed before, had historically settled in a fertile region of North Persia, and in particular center around the city of Gorgo. That is exactly the one of the wall. In fact, it's likely, the modern Gurgan/Gorgan in northeastern Iran, or, because this is also possible, an anonymous Hephthalite center further east. I would say it's unlikely, but again, that's what we get from the Byzantine source. They had a structured society governed by a single ruler, so of course there's a bit of embellishment here. They were sort of less structured systems than the Persian one. They were comparatively some sort of, not necessarily provincial power, they were regional in scope and ambition. But here the meaning is that they were in the moment politically united. They had a strong leader in practice. So their tactics combined mobility with strategic deception. We will read better at some point, like the military history of these peoples through the Strategicon, because we made that for other, especially European people, to talk about the Germans, the Slavs, the Avars, but we also have to talk about these Eastern enemies. And they were also strategically deceitful, notoriously. They were, as we explained countless times in so many videos, basically the further, say, in the step toward the step you go, and the more elusive the enemies are. Not because they're stronger, but because they're weaker. That's a declaration of strategic inferiority. It means that the Sasanians are, of course, like a hell of a military machine, especially compared to these nomads out there. And the best way, we've seen it also with the Persian invasion of Scythia, we've seen this so many times, the best way to bridge that ratio strength gap, you have to withdraw, right? Strategically, to sort of gain, it's actually like leaving the initiative to the enemy is detrimental as it gets, but you can also, on defensive positions, sort of wear out the offender, which also has that sort of higher burden. And so at some point when he is weakened enough, passing to counterattack and hopefully achieving something. The truth is also, it's all more complex than it sounds. We don't have all the specific, like the details that we would like to. But predictably, there is a specific pattern, one of ambush, right? So luring the enemy also in a favorable terrain to putting him in that condition of inferiority that can allow, again, to bridge that gap. Luring Peroz into a trap in a mountainous, forested area with no outlet, showing that these peoples were not just about open plains, open steppe warfare. The Hephthalites surrounded the Persian army. I would like to stress that with that Bactrian background, and more, there were lots of sedentaries in the Hephthalite ranks, right? There would have been some Hephthalite cavalry at the root, but also lots of militias, levies, if anything, drawn from sort of very different places. Not too good, as a matter of fact, but still capable of, serving also the army to create some further sort of logistical chain, acting as pioneers and beyond. I still have to make sort of specific videos, but we talk about this in the videos about the sagas, the fact that there were Saka infantrymen, for example, during the Persian invasion of Greece, and we've seen them also at the Battle of Marathon, just from the Hellenic perspective, like wielding this axis and more. And here there is something similar going on. It's as if here we were watching a movie that for the 10th, the 20th time, we all know how it's going. From the Persians are the same ones of the Parthian times or the Achaemenid times, and from the other side you have the same kind of nomads that, at least by tactics, work in pretty much the same way, right? The Hephthalites, however, succeed in this ambush. Peroz, failing to conduct adequate reconnaissance, was taken prisoner himself, and so this was a debacle. And it's obvious that Procopius wants to say, oh, look, the immense Persian army was annihilated. Surely it was something very big, right? But we can't throw away like the estimate of 70,000, 80,000 men. It was something enormous also, not just militarily and politically. At that point, Khosrau demanded that Peroz prostrate himself and swear never to attack again, which was a massive humiliation. As we've seen also in the Achaemenid architectural propaganda, these steppe peoples were considered at the same level of all of the Persians themselves, of the same stock. That's obviously a long time before, a millennium, right? But not so much had really changed. At this point, yes, there were different religions or at least versions of moral, spiritual attitudes were the same. These populations were also ethnically different to what had been an exhaustion of late antiquity and more. But in a sense, the relations that the Persians, as this feudal empire, right, habituated to lord from, in fact, this Iranian bases, again, from the Iranian plateau over surrounding populations, had some vibe in common with these steppe peoples that were also very questioned, very feudal in their mindset, also still preserving certain autocratic models that the same Persians were searching for, like, to enforce further on their subjects, especially in this period. It's as if they had considered themselves almost peers. Now, advised by the Magi, Peroz performed the obeisance at dawn, facing the rising sun to frame it as a Persian ritual, thus mitigating the humiliation. But it was also baked into the thing, the same thing, because the Hephthalites likely believed more or less in the same things And so this was an important compromise, one that would sort of satisfy both, but in a very low Persian position at this point. Now, Zeno's financial intervention, possibly through Eusebius, secured Perez's release, right, with the Byzantines likely paying tribute to the Hephthalites on Persia's behalf. The Yeshu the Stylite, we're talking this early 6th century Syriac chronicler from Edessa, confirms that Zeno's ransom reconciled the parties, with Perez promising to respect the border, right? So it was not a draw, it was an Hephthalite success, but one that had come at least at the cost of, again, a Persian advance across their territory, the display of immense military power, and some sort of still maintenance of the Persian strategic solidity. It's not like the Hephthalites now were taking over the Sasanian Empire. No, right? They were all exhausted. Both sides had really exhausted themselves in more material terms. More in material terms, they're becoming incredibly precarious at this point. Just think about Belisarius's finest knights that, I don't know, even in a place like Italy, it was still fairly rich at the time, had to use wooden armor because like metal armor was such a incredibly expensive and rare commodity to find that, they literally went by that. Imagine in Central Asia, right? Now, the Persian army, though intact at this point, because it's not had been a climatic showdown or a massive bloodshed of Persian forces. They had probably been bottled in this situation. They surrendered, right? And even at that point, properly, there was a way to say, okay, well, we will not, because it was still dangerous position. We will not essentially annihilate. We will not create a massive sort of collapse, because we don't even have the forces to manage that in case, but we want to secure instead something on our own, or more favorable terms to grant some continuity in that direction. However, the Sasanian army on this occasion suffered a pretty heavy blow to its prestige. Remember, the Sasanian military was incredibly advanced, was one of the sort of few powers that could really threaten Roman hegemony in martial affairs, so to say, and we've seen how, especially from the 3rd century AD, and also by Roman influence, the Parthians had transmuted themselves in the Sasanian dynasty into something much more dangerous, a bit like, I don't know, the Alemanni, the Germanic confederacies had sort of coalesced into something more compact, more also Romanly inspired, equipped, and so on. The Roman army was always very good in general, and regardless of sort of victories and defeats, they represented the gold standard of military capacity. But the Sasanians were really no joke either, right? So if anything, this first campaign underscored Perez's recklessness in pursuing enemies without caution, and or something around that, because it's easy, like in a history, to say, oh, well, they didn't send the scouts and they ended up ambushed. Well, yeah, kind of, but it's also like, were you actually there? Even if you knew people were there, like, are you writing simply with the idea that you have to explain so directly and sort of unequivocally everything just by saying, okay, well, they simply fell in an ambush because they didn't use scouts? Like, obviously the Persian army would have used the scouts. There would have been lots of those. Probably something else happened, also treason, and also some other negligence, but sort of a more complex picture is more likely to be compounded. It's also the stretches of the terrain. It's logistics, is how far you can go. Maybe they literally overstretched and they found themselves in that situation due to supplies shortages. I mean, the landscape there is unforgiving. It's not, again, open steppe, but it's something really wild by what we're habituated, especially, say, from a European Mediterranean perspective. Now, the second campaign, around 478-479, was triggered by internal Hephthalite dissent. Balami, the 10th century Persian historian and vizier, author of a major Persian version of Tabari's Chronicle, reports that Hephthalite refugees fleeing Kushnavatz's tyrannical rule sought asylum in Persia, which was also an habitual practice for the Persians to co-opt here we're talking refugees were not beggars with, their own rags and loaded some donkey. Like, they were essentially entire clans that had literally been exiled, that were escaping and seeking, like, it was a pretty prestigious position in Persia that would settle them on this northeastern frontier themselves, as the Persians had always been doing with all these populations. We've seen it with the Sakas as well. And so all people that could work as a Trojan horse as far as this Hephthalite dominion was concerned for further expeditions. And, using the same science, the same oligarchs as possible new leaders, new puppet rulers on behalf of the Sasanians in Bactria. Now, Peroz at this point, perceiving an opportunity to exploit such political crisis, evidently, sent envoys demanding that Khosrau reform his governance or face invasion, which was basically say either you sort of start paying tribute to us and accept our officials or something, or else, right? After 4 years, with the number of refugees swelling, so showing an increasing and at this point dangerously escalating political instability, Peroz mobilized an army of approximately 50,000 men, they say, they may have been simply less than the other time, like say 25,000, and marched towards Balkh, separated from Hephthalite territory by the Merv Desert. So again, very interesting environment, very difficult one to operate in. These armies, however, are partially well suited to that terrain because they literally either come from there and or they, in Persian military culture, they're habituated to this kind of landscapes in their native land, and or they have sort of important bases. Imagine, of course, the Sasanian Empire being kept together in part, especially with all that heavy cavalry, by sort of very specific bases with forage, with fortified emplacements that could support probably an entire army in their magazines, with their stocks. So there was a moment in which you surpassed that, and it was the steppe and or something where you couldn't have all that infrastructural support, and that's where things started becoming more difficult. Naturally, the Bactrian basin was at large more accessible, but it was also difficult to reach, very distant, just to move an army across even the friendly territory from Persia to there was an enormous enterprise. And naturally, many of the Persians were also just Hephthalites themselves, so that they would be closer to home, better suited to the circumstances, also just more capable of finding this native territories. Now, the Hephthalites devised a cunning ruse once again. A mutilated retainer, claiming to have been punished for warning Khosrau of Persian strength, misled Peroz into a grueling desert route. So basically something similar to what had happened the other time. It's fascinating that the complexity of this landscape, climatic, ecologically, by terrain and so on, is akin to a labyrinth, right? When you look at these regional forces, you realize that even just to water the horses, you couldn't access even certain basins, even during certain times of the year. If the weather was not humid enough, you wouldn't even probably find what you needed for the forage and more. So this was yet another bad mistake. Exhausted and dehydrated, the Persian army reached a point with no retreat, where the retainer revealed his deception, right? And it was, surprise, surprise. Now, recognizing their predicament, Peroz's forces sought peace once again. So this expedition was virtually aborted. Naturally, there were some Hephthalite forces out there. In fact, again, weaker, but in fact needing to recur to this deception in order to make it. The Hephthalites on this occasion also do not press further because they likely don't have enough manpower. They permitted the Sasanian withdrawal in exchange for a column marking a new border, likely around Merv, and substantial ransom. This is very fascinating because, as we've seen also in other cultures and Schwerpunkt, if you think about the Kumans, like in the steppes at some point, there isn't much of an identifiable landmark that you can say, well, naturally speaking, I don't know, you're easily disoriented as you seen here the same Sasanian army allegedly got lost in the desert and or took that path thinking that would have been better one. Maybe it's also depending on time of the year, whatever. On other also climatic changes during the campaign, during the season, you may never know what happened there. Brusque excursions, sort of different changing weather and so on. And so they would literally erect a column to say, okay, well, that's the unequivocal sign of where a land begins and another ends, right? And Merv is also a very interesting location. It was a very big city, one of the many Alexandrias founded by the same Megas, the ancient Antiocheia in Margiana. And again, one of the in fact, northeasternmost possessions of whoever basically controlled the what essentially was the older Achaemenid Empire, territorially speaking. So for passing through the Diadochoid, later, let's say, in fact, resurrected Iranian power, up to this point where things were now taken over by its Hephthalites on the frontier. We're not even 100% sure about the location here. We just, again, hear the stories almost anecdotally. Yeshu the Stylite provides additional details, noting that Peroz was again captured on that occasion, which definitely doesn't make him a particularly successful commander, promising 30 mule loads of silver drachmas to have himself freed. So basically the Hephthalites used Peroz as a turning credit card at that point. Now, with only 20 loads available due to depleted state coffers, because that's a hell of a, it's an imperial ransom really, Peroz left his son Kavad. Essentially, the Kavad the first reigned between 488-496 and 498-531, because, again, Persia is not a greatly stable country, as a hostage for 3 years, right, in his stead. Upon return, at which, by the way, does sound like something really bad had happened to the Persians during this campaign as well. So something similar to last time. Upon returning, Peroz imposed a poll tax to raise the remaining sum of his ransom, securing Kavad's release. Thus, this defeat further eroded Sasanian authority in the region, to say the least, encouraging revolts, for example, in the Caucasus, particularly in Albania, Iberia, and Persia-Armenia, where Christian populations, incensed by Peroz's persecution and new taxes to fund probably the military expeditions, rebelled, were in 481-482. The revolts in the Caucasus added another layer of complexity to Peroz's reign. In fact, in 481, the Albanians rose against Persian rule, followed by the Iberians under King Vakhtang I Gorgasali, who reigned roughly between 447 and 522. The famous Christian king of Iberia, later canonized by the Georgian Church, the Persian-Armenians, led by Vahan Mamikonian, died in 505, head of the powerful Armenian homonymous noble house and hero of the Armenian national tradition, joined the rebellion, 482, defeating a Persian force at the Battle of Akori on Mount Ararat. Quite a spectacle, also by landscape, a bit like an Olympian vision. Now, the Persians, under commanders like Zarmir Karin, a leading member of another powerful Persian family, and Miran, a general from the, in fact, Miranid Parthian noble house, responded with aggressive campaigns. In 483, at the Battle of Nerse-Hapat in Artaz, the Persians, employing Bahram V Gurs, who reigned between 420 and 438, the famous Bahram the Wild Ass, known for his hunting prowess and military reforms, tactic of rapid cavalry charges, supported by archer initially, overwhelmed the Armenians. Those things were just part of the Persian martial art from quite a while, but there was a consistent effort from the Sasanian side to sort of standardize, to uniform. Again, they were, especially in this, closer to Mesopotamia, to the west, tendentially better organized, sort of more uniform patterns, and the Armenians were the weaker side in principle, but Vahan's personal bravery managed to turn the side, securing a temporary victory. At least, again, it's not like the Armenians could run up to the walls of Ctesiphon. However, it was a first stop. Later that year in Iberia, however, Persian victory was already facilitated by the betrayal of the Persian-Armenian commander Barj Vaivuni, forcing the same Vahan to retreat at that point to the Mamikonian domains near the Roman border. We've seen Armenian warfare, many videos. It's also very feudal, Persian influence type of warfare. Armenia is orographically a nightmare. It's a heavily feudal country as well, very heavily fortified, lots of this sort of pastures in the highlands, sort of breeding pretty tough cavalry, but also a sedentary country, as a matter of fact. A very interesting combination of cavalry, infantry. We have seen the Armenians in action as also Byzantine auxiliaries at different times, and we'll continue along that pattern, looking a bit more into their warfare. At this point, so the Caucasian theater was sort of a bit normalized, and Peroz's focus on the Hephthalites prevented the Sasanians from delving a final blow to the Armenian rebels. The same Peroz recalled Miran in February 483 to prepare for his final campaign, thus subtracting sort of important manpower, leadership, etc., to direct against the Hephthalites. And that's where the third campaign happens, where in 483-484, when Peroz is desperate at this point, after two failures already, attempt to erase the shame of his prior defeats, despite vehement opposition from his advisors, takes place. And that's where things get really interesting. So the supreme Mobed, that was the chief Zoroastrian priest, military leaders, and nobles like Mutbudvad warned against breaking the oath, not to invade Hephthalite territory, with the latter nobleman sealing his dissent in a document, even saying, like, this is not on me. I said that this was not to be done. Don't blame me after things go wrong. And there were serious reasons for serious precedents, in particular to, in general, it was a very difficult campaign. But Peroz's leadership had been stained to this point. The guy, however, you gotta really admire him for different reasons, as you understand now, because undeterred assembled, but yet again, a massive force. At this point, sources claim 100,000 men, 500 elephants. Yeah, as if he could have ever done anything like this. Like, it's naturally unlikely. At this point, we can easily say already, if we think, this was maybe at most 30,000 men. Elephants, probably not even 100. We are told, however, that at this point, different allies participated, hence also the elephants. For example, there are Indian allies that arrived at Gurga. So this is fascinating because they crossed an incredibly large amount of territory. Of course, the Persians paid for that, likely because there was no normal way to arrive up to those places. They facilitated transit to stiffen numbers. This shows two things. First of all, that banally here the Persians were taking things seriously enough, but a part of the establishment, as we've seen, had not green-lighted this, so Peroz had to rely on foreigners. And which foreigners would come to fight for someone who's not, as we've seen, very well published by the circumstances? Well, foreigners that feel a threat of Hephthalite overexpansion. And indeed, following the path of the Indo-Scythians, the Hephthalites were threatening the same Indian subcontinent. And that's why some Indian allies sent reinforcements. Now, to circumvent his previous oaths made to the enemies, just think how the Persians reasoned at that time. There are those phrases probably by Herodotus. They really tell you that they cared about giving word, the fact that they believed that the Aryan winged glory would fly away from them if they infringed upon pacts, etc. There was this heavily chivalric sense of international policy, as we were saying before. There were also more practical reasons for doing this all. But Peroz essentially had the border column transported ahead by 50 elephants. So to say, we're not actually crossing the column as long as we literally advance with that in front of us, which is also actually an insult to the Hephthalites. The sticking to the word given, and a move that Modeb condemned as perjury anyway. Now the Hephthalites, informed of the invasion, prepared a trap near Balkh once again. You see the same identical pattern. Again, aside from the epos of this whole story, the foreign histories, you understand how familiar this pattern is. Really, throughout all history, we've seen it so many times. On this occasion, Kush-Navats dug a trench, 10 cubits wide and 20 deep, concealed with reeds and earth, leaving a narrow causeway. Displaying the salt of Peroz's broken oath on his banner, Kush-Navats challenged Peroz to single combat, further demoralizing the Persians. The Hephthalites executed a feint retreat, luring Peroz's army into a reckless pursuit across the plain. The Persians, driven by fury, fell into the trench, resulting in a catastrophic defeat. Peroz, along with many of his sons, perished, and the army was annihilated. The Hephthalites plundered Sasanian territories for 2 years, capturing key cities like Nishapur, Herat, and Merv. Again, the great oasis city, modern Turkmenistan, one of the empire's eastern metropolises. This was really, the final achieving crown of Peroz's military disasters, right? And the third expedition was, to an extent, even the most threatening to the Hephthalites. But as you've seen here through this trick, now I would like to point out in this video that the information that we have about all this is very dubious, to say the least. We can't sort of imagine here what would have been the relation between the two, like we are told by Procopius about, for example, the fact that the Huns had created this concealed ditch, etc. Again, I don't want to digress in philosophy of history and method and so on, but in general, like, it's not much what we're told in a precise or sort of simply reliable sense. It's about the bigger picture. Like, if you're habituated to see this kind of dynamics going on, you know that the way they work, it's sort of kind of makes sense, right? The fact, for example, the Huns here, the White Huns create this barrier, this ditch, this sort of, they with ramparts. Normally, these peoples had a way to do so. Think about the fortified rings of the nomadic peoples, the fact that here, as we've seen, was not even completely a steppe wasteland. They had, say, infantry to defend that stuff. So, again, whether we're talking about tactical, more likely strategic surprise, we're always discussing essentially a mobile force that is helped by some infrastructure. I just, this year written an article about a battle in the 14th century where there is exactly something very similar, completely different Western context, etc. But the enemy is attracted in the sort of normal depth formation, battle after battle, to the mouth of the enemy camps, where that are very well reinforced. There are missile troops deployed on the ramparts and so on, and the clash consumes itself against this defensive line, right? So when we look at it here, it's not like, the Hephthalites simply fooled Peroz, etc. Actually, this seemed to have been a pretty talented, resourceful ruler, just to be in charge. As we've seen, the Hephthalites had helped him coming to power to begin with. There was some further experience, even with these peoples, with so many battles, and there was, in spite of the defeat, the capacity even not just to defend, but to attack them, to mount up this expedition. So it's quite fascinating to observe the resilience of Persian power in all this. And interestingly enough, the Bandian fire temple dated to Peroz's on Kavad's reign preserves stucco reliefs depicting Sasanian victories, even though, as we've seen here, there wasn't much to celebrate. Likely, this stuff was naturally idealized. It was all a canon of Persian art depicting the perfect serenity and of the King of Kings rule, so to say, and idealizing to counterbalance the aforementioned losses, showcasing scenes of hunts, battles, triumphs that reflect, again, Sasanian propaganda force to maintain legitimacy, especially also in that area, right? Because even though the Hephthalites inflict this devastating defeat on the Sasanians, and these had to pay tribute to them, they still managed to hold out. The Persians still managed to hold out the Hephthalites, and that's where also the Great Wall of Gorgan comes into play. Because as we've seen, the campaigns had been fought around this quite impressive defense that the Persian army would have fallen back on. This wall was also called the Red Snake due to its reddish bricks and its sort of serpentine length. Is located again in the modern Golestan province of Iran. It was a cornerstone of Sasanian defense strategy during this period, stretching, we said it before, almost 100 kilometers from the Caspian Sea to the Pishkamar Mountains, with over 30 fortresses spaced at sort of tens of kilometers from one another, with intervals proper. It was designed to shield the Sasanian heartland from northern nomadic incursions, including those by the Hephthalites. Constructed with fired bricks from local loess soil, the wall, 6 to 10 meters wide, featured a 5-meter ditch for water management, reflecting advanced engineering. The Persians were masters of that because large swathes of their lands were arid, and as such they had all specific means of water collection, especially underground. This was not much the case here because it wasn't a particularly, it is a semi-arid area, but at large, like, this was a relatively less sophisticated means of water collection, likely fortified during Peroz's preparations for 473, because it already existed, but it would sort of be reinforced depending on the circumstances, alongside logistical hubs like Ram Fairuz and Rushan Fairuz near Rai and Gurgan. The wall supported both defensive and offensive operations in a broader strategic sense, as also from Hadrian's wall, like it had sort of point d'appui function, essentially. Now, estimates suggest a garrison of 15,000 to 36,000 troops, essentially comparable to Hadrian's wall, underscoring its strategic importance. Naturally, and I made a video about the Dilimitane in Justinian's time, like, things weren't optimal by those times. Say, most of these troops were essentially some local part-time levies that worked in the nearby, so they basically just were attached to the infrastructure, to the settlements around the fortresses and so on. They weren't professional soldiers. There wasn't, of course, any economical means to maintain them. And the same wall, of course, would sort of the Paris historically without some further reinforcement. It's a bit just like the Roman fortifications, etc. Now, the cost was, however, immense at large, like for the Persians, and it underscores also probably the Persian capacities to still maintain, by this point, some substantial late antique style scale of military infrastructure. The wall's location in Hyrcania, that is a geographic bottleneck, made it a critical barrier, though it could not prevent the Hephthalite invasions following Peroz's defeat in 484. Right? You see what we're talking about. Essentially, that there's the Iranian plateau and just this 200 kilometers to the Caspian Sea in an area that, again, is basically more opening towards the east. And so it's not actually the narrowest part. It is also less than 200 kilometers for that matter. But itself, in fact, is projected towards the north. If you look at the map, like the Everest mountains are in sort of running parallel, basically. They also curve towards the northeast, so it encloses at some point, but it's not between. Again, the Iranian plateau and the Caspian Sea in a sort of latitudinal sense, in a extending at least in a latitudinal sense, but in a longitudinal one. The wall's construction was possibly initiated in the late 5th or early 6th century. So we're more or less in the same era, but as it happens also for other fortifications of this kind, think about the Dannevirke. All right, it's not like it was built just at a point. It was basically developing further throughout the ages, and there had been great empires who had needed such barriers. So while I don't know what's the archaeological point of research is, right, but based on radiocarbon dating, we think that more or less the age in which it was, like, the remains are the most visible, most famous remains come from, it suggests not just this age, but also in fact continuous development, highlighting at this point in this generation Sasanian efforts to secure their northern frontier. And so coping with the Hephthalites at that point, that were the power that existed there. By the way, this wall complemented similar fortifications at Derbent in the western Caspian. That was yet another bottleneck, as we were highlighting before. So the aftermath of the 484 disaster plunged the Sasanian Empire into chaos. Sukhra, head of the powerful Karen family and de facto regent between 484-493, identified as a nobleman, as Zarmir Karen in Armenian sources, by the way, emerged as a stabilizing force. He managed to sort of rally enough troops to maintain an effective deterrence. Appointed deputy in Ctesiphon, Sukhra launched a campaign in 484, specifically to avenge Peroz's death. By the way, we will talk more about about Zoroastrianism, but probably the legacy of Iran in the Europeanly speaking, and how, for example, also the Islamic concept of jihad is, sort of the changes that had happened within the same Iranian world. It's just like, I don't know, what had happened with Rome and then with Christianity. Like, it's a completely different moral landscape, but they were all sort of motivated also in its in their uncompromising aspect from Persia. And so there is a mystical, spiritual, transcendental mission here to fulfill, because if you show that the empire lost it, everything is going to collapse. All right, so this shows you also how precarious the condition of the greatest powers of the era really were in general. Marching to Gorgan, Sukhra defeated Kushnavats, who sued for peace at that point. That was a great turning moment. As we said at the beginning, there is a gradual path to victory after the darkest moment. This Sasanian victory was so straightforward that the Hephthalites returned Peroz's treasures, the chief priest, by the way, which was also yet another enormous loss for the empire to that point, and Peroz's daughter, Peroz Duct. This was the redeeming victory, restoring some, at least, of the Sasanian prestige, enabling Sukhra to install Peroz's brother Balash, who reigned between 484-488 as king. Again, we know very few about what actually happened, or at least how it happened. We understand, again, that both sides are not infinite. Right? Here, the Persians, if anything, show dramatic resilience, the Hephthalites so, right? At least in the moment in which balance tilts once again in favor of the Normans. Balash, in fact, proved an ineffective ruler against especially the ongoing Hephthalite incursions. because the Sasanian frontier had been significantly stabilized. You see, less resources means the frontier shrinks anyway, right? So think about all the wars, and you think how antiquity ended. It's not much, again, plague, or even the plague may have simply come from all this overexhaustion. The fatigue is palpable in all of this. And when things crumble, there are also incursions as individual war bands, as single groups that you can't even properly stem, right? If you want to achieve more, you coalesce. Otherwise, you can also go over to the Persians to find a job as a mercenary. That works, but in general, the northeastern frontier is definitely not stronger than before. Balash's 4-year reign was marked by continued tribute payments to the Hephthalites in all of this, so showing that things were not good. Sucra's negotiations, however, ended at least the Caucasian revolts, securing Perse-Armenian support to defeat a rival claimant. It was Zark, who sought refuge in the mountains of the Caucasus but was captured by the Sasanians. Kavad I, finally Peroz' son, ascended in 488 after fleeing to the Hephthalites because of the perennial power struggles within the same royal court and backed by the various elements of Persian nobility. Had those remained always sort of cohesive, things were likely taken sort of different turn, but this is a bit like the history of the entire world, right? Kavad had fled while his brother was in charge for certain sense obvious reasons, and he had also on this occasion married Kusnavas' daughter, returning even with home in Persia with an Hephthalite army to depose Balash himself, ousted in 496 due to internal opposition. Kavad again sought Hephthalite aid, returning in 498 with allegedly 30,000 troops to reclaim the throne, ruling until 531. You understand here we are skipping also the details of Persian warfare, because we can't make some videos trying to detail the power changes, loss of the regime, the coups, in all this. We're here looking at what mostly pertains to the Hephthalites, right? Under Kavad, the Sasanians continued paying tribute, in any case, to the Hephthalites until consolidated power, eventually ceasing these payments. You understand how tense the relations always were, and imagine just living in that frontier. Just think how much of whatever could have been like the deterrent capacity of the Persians to stabilize a frontier in a sanitary sense, like the farmlands, the population. This can easily, especially in pre-industrial times, where agriculture is so incredibly fragile, there is so few energy expandable, the technology of the era. A raid can devastate an area for generations and generate major massive expeditions like the ones we've seen, right? So this is a moment of further decline, very much like the one we see in Europe, in China, and pretty much anywhere else, including among the Hephthalites, because it doesn't matter how many blows they can inflict in this frontier to the Sasanians, still the latter are the bigger regional force. The Hephthalites are more unstable, they're paying more proportionally, even though they can sort of push the Sasanians likely with much less resources than the ones that the Sasanians used to invade these nomads. Still, for them, it's really a great issue. And in fact, we arrived to the last chapter. The Hephthalite threat persisted until the reign of Khosrau I, 531-579. That is remembered as the greater ruler in Sasanian history for a reason. Khosrau I sought to avenge his grandfather's defeat. It was a matter of blood to purify. After securing a peace treaty with the Byzantines, Khosrau allied with the Gökturks under Istemi, the western Yabgu/Kagan of the Göktürk Khaganate, brother of the same founder Bumin Kagan, capitalizing, in fact, on their rivalry with the Hephthalites in Central Asia. So again, I made a video about the Gökturks, you can check out if you're interested. You understand what's their military culture, their connections also with China, what they're doing also in the West, and so on. The Hephthalites, though militarily formidable, lacked the organization to fight on multiple fronts because of the aforementioned reasons. It's not a territorial problem, it's literally a problem of resources, and the Göktürks are really something. In the Battle of Gol-Zarriun that was fought around 560 near Bukhara, the historic city in modern Uzbekistan, a major center on the Silk Road, it would become also one of the most important cities in Islam, a caravan center in this sort of in between nomadic and sedentary world. The Sasanian-Turkic alliance launched a coordinated assault. This was very clever because Khosrau understood that all his grandfather's campaigns had been disastrous as sort of monolateral, right? So if an ally could be brought in the fray, an ally that was ambitious like the Göktürks, and that could not, even in their case, overstretch against Persia in general, a profitable result could occur. The Hephthalites, supported by troops from Balkh, Shugnan, Amol, Zamn, Kutal, Termez, and Bashkirt, were overwhelmed in this circumstance. It is true, we should see better from their side what was going on. It's evident that their same power was gradually melting away. Not just because the Sasanians had bled them white by an extent with those, so making the Hephthalite ones Pyrrhic victories to an extent, but because simply these peoples, once they had reached the peak of their power, sort of faded, melted away, right? They didn't have a sedentary interland to robustly withstand like another regional onslaught. They tended to dissolve themselves, to melt among other conquerors. In fact, the Göktürks from the east seized territories north of the Oxus River, while the Sasanians annexed the south, effectively dismantling the Hephthalite Empire. The Hephthalite prince Faganish, ruling Chaganiyan, became a Sasanian vassal after negotiations in Gurgan, where Khosrau asserted dominance over the Göktürks themselves, requiring Faganish to seek approval in Ctesiphon. This is quite interesting because it shows from one side that not just Khosrau dramatically succeeded in wiping out the Hephthalites, at least as a broader regional threat, but to gather the remnants, not differently from what, I don't know, the Byzantines were doing with the Ostrogoths in Italy or the Vandals in Africa. After they destroyed them, either they sort of deported them somewhere else to use as garrisons, including in the east, by the way. There were the Longobards in Armenia, for example, among the many Sumakoi of the Byzantines. So they would have known something about these Sasanian-Hephthalite events, but also just maintaining them basically there, right, in their land as a buffer force, given that they had already been settled exactly as garrisons, to themselves sort of create problems again, or sort of defend themselves from other groups. Today, again, we focus on what the Sasanians and the Hephthalites were doing with one another. As you understand, we know much more about, it's a Persian story, all right, because the Hephthalites didn't leave us really much from their side. Historically, again, there are many sources. We also know something from the east of this. But here what matters is really Khosrau's success, right? The Göktürks were equally, like, they couldn't, as we were saying before, simply threaten the Sasanian Empire as a wall, but they could somehow partially substitute themselves into Bactria to the Hephthalites, create other problems. And so at that point, the remainders of the Hephthalites that have been practically destroyed at this point are usefully spent as cannon fodder, if you want, against this new terrible steppe Khaganate. As you know, was immense and sort of developed probably an oceanic ideology of steppe power. They also, as we explained in the video about the Göktürks, have this enormous territory, but because the steppe had exhausted themselves, so it's not much like they could actually control that whole thing in a centralized way, but probably the kinetic energy of late antiquity had ended, and so certain scenarios are relatively frozen. And in fact, when some more force is regenerated, things start fluidifying once again. These events established the Oxus as the eastern frontier between the Sasanians and the Göktürks. However, tensions over the Silk Road trade soon strained this alliance, leading to a Göktürk Byzantine proposal, even in 568, for a joint attack on the Sasanians, which ultimately failed due to logistical and political constraints. But it's a bit like the Sasanians will do with the Avars against Constantinople, in a more effective way, by the way, even though they failed. 568 is also the year in which the Longobards enter Italy, so the Byzantines they were actually okay with that initially, but things got out of hand. So you understand here the picture and how interesting it is, how we know fairly a lot, considering the times and places, about this world dynamic. But it's also something really so similar to normal dynamics in the region since ever, right? Peroz's defeats had a lasting impact on Sasanian warfare, apparently. Under Bahram V Gur, the Sasanians had adopted this sort of dynamic cavalry tactic, blending rapid lance charges with powerful archery, which was their thing, actually. They hadn't learned from the Roman, Armenian, or Arabs. They were the champions in that, but they had managed to sort of put back their forces together and even coping against nomadic forces, not just the heavier Roman ones, over which they were essentially modeled, all right, to counter the greatest foe. But also in similar ways, again, there's all these neighboring peoples fought, right? When used cautiously, these tactics were quite effective. You needed, of course, an experienced leader, in fact, veteran troops by some degree, good supplies, like having the luck that every great commander forcibly requires in order to win. And the Persians were, in that sense, very experienced in engaging nomadic enemies like the Hephthalites with minimal exposure, for example, to their archery barrages, or at least knowing perfectly well how to cope with that, because they were similar to them. However, Peroz's reckless pursuits led to catastrophic losses in any case, prompting a return to a more either a more conservative doctrine, or at least realizing that those enemies were a bit more advanced than they seemed, especially considering that, as we explained before, they had sedentarized. And when we look at, also from the Hephthalite side at the employment of field fortifications to support their tactics, you realize that the Persians there were facing sort of pretty good enemy. Like, we don't have to overly sort of evaluate the Hephthalites just because they won. This happens. There are lots of inferior cultures that win wars over more advanced countries. But aside from the fact that here the contenders were relatively similar, we're also talking about pretty standard tactics in the regions from a very long time. What mattered there was this sort of new Turkic waves of the steppes that partially reinvigorated the latter, but that were also much less lasting individually than what the Indo-European ones had historically been. And so there is a bit of also now more religious clash. Say Zoroastrianism is a much more fully defined religion in a modern sense, monotheistically tending, or if not, sort of always centered on the idea of God, but in a more now advanced sense, whereas the Turks also, they share something similar in a universal traditional sense, but they're wilder and they're ethnically different. The world does not look good. Like, it would be very interesting to know what the Persians actually thought about this new waves of Turkic barbarians that had been as Proto-Turco-Mongols confined by millennia of Indo-European bullying in the sort of the ghettoist part of the steppe in the far northeast Asia, and actually being dominated by the Indo-Europeans themselves. So it's really interesting to look at this general decadence also from the Persian side against foes like this that were probably not even the single greatest. It's like the Black Huns. They are overrated, right? The Huns, we made too big of an issue that they actually were, especially in terms of military quality back in the day. The Avars were much worse, but since in the West we had just partially something of them, maybe in Germany and partly in Italy, like nobody has made much of a myth out of them. Also, we're talking the 7th century at the peak their power, and they mostly attacked the Byzantines anyway. So it's interesting how we picture these peoples. Made lots of videos also about the Huns regarding this. And remember, there is always my Eurasian warfare series that deals with exactly all these various waves of peoples, one after the other, and how they exemplified the changes within the same steppe warfare in a non-quite flattering sense. I mean, you realize that sedentary civilizations became ever stronger, and the steppes basically faded into obscurity by the end of the Middle Ages. Now, after 484, Persian commanders favored prolonged archery exchanges in broken terrain. In other words, they became more cautious themselves. They also probably had an exhaustion of their heavier cavalry scalar deployment in such faraway frontiers, so they became more cautious against ambushes. They, however, just fought with more auxiliaries themselves. It's not much a matter of doctrine, right, or tactics. It's just like a simple adaptation to the circumstances. Then we will talk more about the Sasanian military and what changes in their warfare. But in a sense, it's not really imperceptible, but it's something that you have to evaluate also in the different theaters, because this is not like the Roman army that at large mostly operates in a civilized context and has, in fact, a solid sort of civilization, statal continuity to strengthen its backbone. It's relatively uniform and homogeneous as a broader Mediterranean civilization. Persia is very composite, it's very weird. It has this Semitic center, Ctesiphon as the more advanced place, and then the feudal Persian highlands. They're very different worlds, and so it's all very much more provincial in the various theaters of war regarding what you're looking at. And so this video hopefully explains the reason why, partly. Methodical cavalry engagements were still part of the broader tactics. They prioritized discipline over mobility in general, but in the frontier, it was better to fluidify and to create these screens, not just tactically, but strategically, to sort of create some sort of defense in depth, just to speak in a Lutvakian term. Now, this shift is partially documented in the Roman Strategicon, the late 6th century Byzantine military manual, the Pseudo-Maurice. The sacrifice of tactical flexibility for, or at least combined arm tactics for safety, right? Limiting the ability to exploit cavalry speed in open terrain and pursue retreating enemies effectively. This is something which, in any case, encompasses a bit all these great civilizations that make ever greater effort, right? What do you learn from Peroz? It's big, massive expeditions, the conventional ways that were just not worth it. Cost-benefit ratio was just decadent, right? So it was true that in the moment, likely, those expeditions were necessary, but at the same time, there could have been also better handling of them, just in terms of power, of sort of resources distribution, etc. That's why the lessons from Peroz's failures shaped Sasanian warfare for generations. It would be very interesting to see in other videos about the relation of the Parthians with northeastern populations, because with Rome, it's just like with Rome, we say, well, essentially up to the 3rd century, they didn't meet with any, say, after the conquest of Mediterranean, with any enemy worth sort of the same Roman military standards, right? So equally, you would think the Parthians had something going on. It wasn't like in the same way that the migration era was had not yet started. But in the east, there is more migration. Also, the Parthians were, as we've seen against the Romans, not really a particularly effective force. Yes, you have things like Carrhae, you have this constant threat potentially, but the Parthians were mocked in the ancient world because they couldn't sort of properly besiege cities. They were they lacked cohesion in Burrs. It's the Sasanians that really step up a bit more that civilizational statal sense, copying the Romans at the end of the day. And so caution over aggressive versatility of Bahram's era was emphasized. Now, the cultural and religious dimensions of these wars are reflected in sites like the Banyan Fire Temple in Dargaz, we mentioned it before, where in northeastern Iran, near the modern Turkmenistan border. And so exactly those areas, from which, by the way, the same Barani, the Parthians, would have originally come from, in part. Not quite, that's probably sort of east of the Caspian. There was slightly, but pretty much like in the same areas. This temple dated to Peroz or Kavad's reign. Excavations revealed a stucco-decorated hall with columns, Pahlavi inscriptions, in a Zoroastrian sanctuary featuring reliefs of Han's battles and triumphs that, again, were probably celebrating Sasanian victories or serving as propaganda, sort of trying to deflect, right, from what had recently happened in attention, underscoring the empire's efforts to project strength amid military setbacks. And the location is meaningful because those were almost, in fact, ethnic Persian areas, not quite historical Persia, but the mold that had created essentially the Arsacid and the later Sasanian power, right? Now, the temple's mihrab and intact decorations highlight also the continuity of Zoroastrian religious practice and its role in legitimizing Sasanian rule during turbulent times. We've seen how rites were important also in, this relation between rulers, what could be essentially displayed or not publicly, even in terms of defeats. How do you sanction a pact between two leaders that have just been spilling blood up to that point between each other? So, again, we know relatively few about this whole thing, but in conclusion, we can say that the Hephthalite-Sasanian wars encapsulate this interplay of ambition, strategic miscalculation, and resilience in Sasanian military history. We would like to have an Hephthalite military history, but unfortunately we're not informed. We probably lack that. Peroz's campaigns, driven by a desire to restore imperial prestige, ended in disaster, weakening the empire, necessitating recovery under Sukra, Kavad, and Khosrau. The Great Wall of Gorgan and the Banyan Temple fire reflect the strategic and cultural mechanisms employed to counter these challenges. Khosrau's victory, facilitated by the Göktürk alliance, marked a turning point, reasserting Sasanian dominance in the east, but introducing new international tensions. And so even though Khosrau understood much better than his grandfather the dynamics that would be conducive to a nominal victory, the times where sort of the Persians would simply walk to the northeastern frontier and destroy everybody that had never properly ever existed, but still they thought that they could sort of tendentially head towards, were kind of over, right? And that sort of the Sasanians had basically just another century of life, so to say. There are some pages of military history that are very unpopularized. They're sort of relatively obscure compared to others, but also considering the times and places, actually fairly well documented. This is one of them. We shall really see different videos about different wars, also the Arab conquest of Persia and more. Now, this war's legacy, particularly in reshaping Sasanian warfare, underscores the enduring impact of Peroz's failures on the empire, a strategic development. In all this, imagine, the Sasanians having to cope with the Byzantines, with other peoples, etc. So it's always an incredible struggle and balance. If you wonder what the Sasanians were doing, it almost always feels like, they were being paid tribute from Constantinople, until you realize how messed up, their entire situation really was. And so it's always this incredible balance of power that inspires you, really. this time in history, the 5th, the 6th century, seeing how still international the world was before the big contraction of also this, what would happen later in the 6th century in particular. Yet one that was already creeping in consistently. Then I was seeing, I think I have a Sasanian playlist. Yeah, only 3, or I actually have 1 video, so, yeah, because we made Julian. Yeah. Yeah, it was not meant properly to be, yeah, it's normal basic Sasanian history. Oh, wait, no, it wasn't. That was warfare as well, Byzantine frontiers. Yeah, well, we have too few, but we have, in any case, a lot of Persian history by this point, right? Especially 33 videos about Persian warfare, and some of it, it's actually, it's really a mix. It's from all eras, right? It's mostly ancient, there are the Achaemenids, the Ilkhanids, yeah, really have a bit, a lot of this, but we also covered, in any case, the Eastern Iranian warfare recently. I have to finish that chapter, by the way. It's quite fascinating. Just for saying that there is always an enormous room for improvement, and there is also always such an enormous amount of military history from sort of the almost strange, like things that you wouldn't think you could simply tell stories. Here I see I haven't really balanced up the various playlists. Sometimes we have videos that yeah, well, at some point we'll fix them. We have lots of new playlists. At least I work to create some of this, and you never really understand how it's working, whether it's working or not. But I must say that these videos, we're reaching somewhere that many people are probably interested to get to, and a more consistent sort of engagement, especially, for example, just banal thing. Frederick II of Babenberg, Duke of Austria, video made the other day. I see very few people watch it to the day after in particular. Then the kind of algorithm thing of YouTube kicks in, and people discover that I exist. It's weird. There are some things for which people are more attracted from nowhere, in others that instead the followers do not like it. So you have this strange, the older followers don't like it. It's a strange mechanism. God only knows at this point how it really works, because how the algorithm works is something then how this applies to the work that you do. It's something that not even YouTube knows, right? They found just a way that sort of makes them earn, but by sort of eyeballing that, not because they have always the answer. But it's, the dynamics are very strange, and in any case, making videos of this kind, I hope, is going to add here, say, when I think Persian wars, because I made lots of videos about auxiliary units of the Persians during the Persian wars. So you see, these are the things in which I fixed, and I was realizing that there weren't as many. And here we also go. There is, fortunately, this one was all well balanced here. Fortunately, we can move manually certain content in the playlist, because it's you never know how it works really. At the end of the day, always strange things, strange mechanisms. That's what YouTube is fundamentally all about. Realizing that. So some of the uploads there years ago, I re-uploaded in a hurry. It would have deserved better pictures. Also AI sucked. I began to use it from just like a couple of years for those pictures, those models I can't find anything on, but sometimes I say, maybe today I should re-upload the video, but nobody really watches those anyway because the audio was even worse than today. But in any case, I was glad to discuss the Sasanian-Hephthalite war. Again, we came finally back to a bit more of Sasanian warfare that really deserves. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.